Okay, this is for week 3, Thursday's Microeconomics class. So we finished chapter 6. Today let's start chapter 7. Chapter 7 is about the efficiency of the markets. So basically we want to answer the following question. Is competitive market equilibrium efficient? Obviously, to understand this, we first need the definition of efficiency. So we will first start with the definition of consumer surplus. And then we will talk about the producer's surplus. And after that, we will formally define the efficiency of the market. And in the end, we will get the following result. That is, the competitive market is the efficient way of organizing economic activities. That is, market equilibrium maximizes efficiency. Okay, so from the previous chapters, we know that the market price has the ability of balancing quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So in the end, the market will be in equilibrium. And because of this balancing effect of price, we will find out the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. Now, the important question is this quantity too small, too large, or just the right? So basically, we're asking a question about economic welfare. Sorry. So this is a field, a subfield of economics, which is the welfare economics. So basically, we will start thinking about buyers' welfares, and then we will talk about sellers' welfares. Now, let's start with a very simple example. And through this example, we will introduce the concept of willingness to pay. And you guys will see that demand curve actually gives you willingness to pay. So the important result of this section is the area below the demand curve and above the price gives you consumer surplus. Okay, now let's start. So let's say you're selling a recording. You're selling a recording of Beatles' first album, and then there are 4 potential buyers: John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Now, clearly there is a limit to the price that each buyer is happy to pay, right? Basically, if the price is too high, then some buyers or all buyers, they just won't buy your album. So how do you measure this, right? So basically, we call each buyer's maximum price is his or her willingness to pay, right? So by defining willingness to pay, you can see that if the price is larger than willingness to pay, then this buyer will not buy the album. And if the price is smaller than the willingness to pay, then this buyer will be happy to buy the album. And in the special case that price equals willingness to pay, in this case, this buyer is indifferent. Here the word being indifferent basically means that this buyer is feeling equally good if he buys it or if he does not buy it. So let's assume these 4 buyers have the following 4 numbers about their willingness to pay. So you can see that John has the highest willingness to pay at $100, and Paul has a willingness to pay at $80. George, $70. Ringo, $50. Now let's say the price is actually $80. So at this price, right? So if price is 80, now I can see that this is the price. And we have learned a buyer will only buy the item if his willingness to pay is larger than the price. So in this case, we know that at price of 80, John will buy the album, right? Now, what about Paul? Well, we have learned if price equals willingness to pay, then this buyer is just indifferent. So here, let's assume that if price equals the willingness to pay, the buyer will not buy it, right? So in this case, you can see that at the price of 80, there would be only one buyer, and John will be the only buyer. The important thing is about calculating consumer surplus, right? So how do you calculate John's surplus? Just think about this. John is happy to pay $100. But in the end, in reality, he only paid $80. This basically implies that there is a $20 surplus, right? So here you can see that the consumer surplus is essentially defined as the difference between the buyer's willingness to pay and the price the buyer actually pays, right? To put it simply, consumer surplus essentially equals willingness to pay minus price, right? Okay. Now let's consider a more complicated case. Let's say we have two identical albums. So you would want to sell these two albums to two different buyers, right? Now let's say the price is 70, right? Okay, now let's see if the price is 70, what happens? So if the price is here at $70, now we would know that John and Paul would buy it, right? So these two guys would buy it. And George is indifferent. Again, to make things simple, let's assume George will not buy this album, right? I would say that in this case, it's obvious that George will not be able to buy it because you have only two identical albums. And if John and Paul, they have higher willingness to pay than George, then the albums will basically go to John and Paul. And even George is happy to get the album, he will not be able to get it. Right? So basically, we could just safely assume that George will not get the album. So in this case, you could see that basically John will have a consumer surplus of 100 minus 70, which is 30. And Paul will have a consumer surplus, which is 80 minus 70, which is 10. So you could see that the total consumer surplus is 40, right? So this is a very simple calculation. And you can see that the total consumer surplus is the sum of all consumers' surplus. So we basically talked about two simple results from this example, right? The first example is consumer surplus is calculated as the difference between a buyer's willingness to pay to the price the buyer actually buys. And then the second result is the total consumer surplus is the sum of all consumers' surpluses. Okay, now let's see how could you actually calculate the consumer surplus when you're given a demand curve. Now, let's start with this example. It's the same example, but the difference is now we are thinking about the relationship between demand curve and consumer surplus. So let's just draw the demand curve of this. Let's assume this is the market for album, right? So let's draw this demand curve for the market of albums. And we have basically 4 buyers in the market. And now let's see what happens at different prices, right? So let's say we're looking at the case of more than $100, right? So the price is quite high, and in this case, we are looking at this line, right? This vertical line. It basically means that the quantity demand is 0. Well, this is obvious because if the price is more than 100, then the willingness to pay of all buyers, right, is lower than the price. So nobody would want to buy the album. Now let's look at the case of $80 to $100. Now in this case, we're looking at this vertical curve. And in this case, you can see that if the price is 80 to 100, then John would buy it, right? So you will have a quantity of 1. That's why you have 1 here. Now we could continue to see other cases, right? So if it's 70 to 80, which is here, in this case, we will see that the additional buyer pool will start buying this album. So we have just 2 buyers, and then the quantity would be 2, right? And you could continue to consider other cases such as 40 to 70 and 50 or less. Clearly, if it's 50 or less, then all buyers would be happy to buy this album. So there would be 4 albums sold in the market, right? So basically, this tells you something important. That is, if you look at these guys' willingness to pay, right? Say you're looking at John's willingness to pay, and you can see that John's willingness to pay is just this $100 number, right? And if you look at Paul's willingness to pay, then it's this $80 number. And George's willingness to pay, you have this $70 number. And Ringo's willingness to pay, you have this $50 number. So basically, you can see that demand curve gives you buyers' willingness to pay, right? So this is the very important result. So let me repeat. Through this example, we could see that demand curve, or the values on the demand curve, give you buyers' willingness to pay. And we also have a related concept, which is called marginal buyer. So marginal buyers are associated with different prices. For example, at the price of 100, who is the marginal buyer? Well, John is the marginal buyer. So at a price of, let me use the red ink. So if price is 100, so if price is 100, John is the marginal buyer. The definition of marginal buyer is as follows. If the price continues to rise, then the buyer will leave the market, right? This is the definition of marginal buyer. So here, why John is the marginal buyer? Well, it's because if price is 100, John is indifferent. So he could buy the album, or he could refuse to buy the album. However, we would know that once the price rises above $100, then John will definitely leave the market, right? So basically, at the price of 100, John is at the verge of leaving the market. So John is the marginal buyer. And then you could talk about the same argument. Let's say at the price of 80, right? At price of 80, Paul is the marginal buyer, because if price rises a little bit above 80, Paul will leave the market, right? So let me summarize, because this one is actually pretty important. First, the demand curve is derived from the willingness to pay of buyers. that is, demand curve gives you buyers' willingness to pay. Second, the price on the demand curve shows us the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer. Marginal buyer is defined as the buyer who would leave the market if the price rises a little bit higher, right? This is useful because if demand curve tells us buyers' willingness to pay, then we could basically use the demand curve to measure consumer surplus, right? Because we know that by definition, consumer surplus is the difference between price and willingness to pay. Now, if we have demand curve, then we would know that consumer surplus is the difference between the demand curve and the price. Right? So how do you define the difference between the demand curve and the price? Well, let's look at the first example, the picture A here, price equals $80. In this case, we have learned John would buy the album, and because his willingness to pay is 100, so the consumer surplus is actually $20. In this case, you could see that the difference, right, the difference between the demand curve and the price is given by this. So, right, so it is essentially this area between demand curve and the price. In this case, consumer surplus can be calculated as the height of the rectangle, which is 20, times the width, which is 1. Right? So surplus equals $20. Now, if we consider the case of $70, in this case, you can see that, again, using the same method, that is, the area between the demand curve and the price gives you consumer surplus. In this case, you can see that we basically have two separate rectangles, right? The first rectangle has the area of 30 times 1. The second rectangle has the area of 10 times 1. So the total consumer surplus equals the total areas, which is 30 plus 10, which gives you 40. Okay, great. Now let's consider how price affects consumer surplus. So here we consider how a lower price would increase consumer surplus. This is fairly intuitive, right? Basically, you can see that if consumer surplus is defined as the difference between willingness to pay and the price. Now, if price decreases, consumer surplus should increase, right? Okay, great. So let's look at the first, the picture on the left-hand side. So basically, the price is at P1, right? And then consumer surplus is given by the triangle ABC. And now you can see that if the price P1 decreases to P2, now the consumer surplus is given by ADF. Right? Again, a triangle, ADF. So the basic result is, as price decreases, consumer surplus increases. Now you can see that we could actually see the amount of increase, right? So basically you can see that the amount of increase is given by this little rectangle and this little triangle, right? And we actually have different reasons for this kind of increase. For this rectangle BDCE, right? You can see that this amount of increase is due to additional consumer surplus to initial consumers. What does this mean? Well, it basically says that Well, it basically says that previously, these buyers, right? These buyers who have bought quantity Q1, they enjoyed this consumer surplus. And now we can see that these same buyers, they're still buying Q1, but due to lower price, right? This is how much consumer surplus they're getting. And in this case, you could see that this rectangle represents the additional consumer surplus to initial buyers. Okay, very simple. Okay, now let's see the little rectangle here, this CEF rectangle. Right? So this guy here. Now you can see that this CEF rectangle, this increase in consumer surplus is due to the fact that new buyers, they enter into the market and then they could make purchases. Because you can see that previously the market quantity was Q1, right? And after the price decrease, additional buyers, to be more specific, these additional buyers, they will buy the additional quantity, Q2 minus Q1, right? And because they're buying these additional quantities, and the price is actually lower than their consumer surplus. So you can see that in this case, there will be some additional consumer surplus because new buyers entering into the market. Right? So this decomposition is actually quite interesting, and it could potentially a exam problem or homework problem. Now let's see this example here. The first one asks, find the marginal buyer's willingness to pay at quantity equals 10. So at quantity equals 10, we have a price of 30, right? And you can see that the marginal buyer's willingness to pay at quantity equals 10 is just 30. Because this guy here, this guy would just leave the market if price rises a little bit above 30. So this guy is a marginal buyer, and his or her willingness to pay should be $30. And now it's the second question. Find consumer surplus at price equals 30. So if price equals 30, then basically we could see that the height of this rectangle is 10, and the base of the rectangle is also 10, and the area of triangle, this one is a triangle, and the area of this triangle equals 1 divided by 2 times base times height. Obviously, you have to know this formula to find out consumer surplus, right? So again, if you have a triangle, and to be more specific, it's this so-called 90-degree triangle, right? Because this angle here is 90 degrees. For this special case, you could just use 1/2 times base times height. This gives you the area of the triangle, which is 50 in this case. Now the last question, suppose price falls to 20. Right? So the initial price was 30, and the price falls to 20. Now we could see a increase in consumer surplus, and to be more specific, we can decompose the amount of increase into two components. So this part is because initial buyers are getting lower price, so they have additional consumer surplus. And this part is because new buyers, they are entering the market. So let's just calculate the area of this rectangle and the area of this triangle. Okay, so for the first question, buyers entering the market. In this case, we could see that So for problem 1, we could see the base and height are again both 10, right? So it's 1 over 2 times 10 times 10. This gives us 50. It is again both are 10 because this is 10 and this height is also 10. And the second one is about existing buyers paying lower price. So the area of this rectangle is given by 10 times 10, right? So 10 times 10, which is 100. So again, this width here is just a 10. Okay, that's great. Now let's talk about the other side of the market, producer's surplus, right? Again, we start with a very simple example. Let's say you want to paint your house and you want to auction your painting jobs to 4 sellers, right? The 4 sellers are May, Frida, Georgia, and your grandma. So this table gives us the cost of these 4 sellers, right? So Mary has the highest cost, which is 900. Your grandma has the lowest cost, only at $500. Now you can imagine that as a seller, you will only sell your product or sell your service only if the price is higher than your cost, right? So here, cost is basically a seller's willingness to sell, right? So cost, cost is a measure of a seller's willingness to sell. And to be more specific, basically that if price is larger than cost, then the seller will be happy to sell her service or product. If price is lower than cost, then the seller will not sell his service or product. And if price equals cost, then a seller will be indifferent from selling her service or not, right? Because she is feeling equally good with selling the service or without selling the service. So now let's assume the final price is actually $600, right? So you can see that if the price is $600, it is here. In this case, we know that Mary and Frida will not offer their services, and Georgia is indifferent, but there is only one house. So you can see that in the end, grandma will actually get the painting job. The reason is because grandma has the lowest willingness to sell, right? So she would be the winner. So in this case, what is grandma's producer's surplus? Well, you can see that grandma is basically happy to offer this service at $500. But in the end, grandma is actually getting $600. So you could imagine the producer's surplus is given by 600 minus 500. So here, the amount of producer's surplus is 100. To summarize, a producer's surplus is calculated as the amount a seller is paid minus the cost of production. So to simplify it, producer's surplus is essentially price minus cost. Now let's assume we have a slightly complicated case. So here, let's say you have 2 identical houses and you want some painting down for these 2 houses, right? And let's say you want to offer this job to different painters. In this case, let's say the price is 800, right? If we go back to the table, right, we could find out if price is 800 with only 2 houses, then the sellers with the lowest costs will win the job. So Georgia and grandma will offer their service. In this case, if the price is $800, then for Georgia, then then her producer surplus is 200. For grandma, her producer surplus is 300. So the total surplus is 500. So here the lesson is the total producer surplus is the sum of all producer surplus. Again, through this example, we have two basic results, right? First, producer surplus is calculated as the difference between the price received by the seller and the cost of production from the seller. Second, the total producer surplus is the sum of all producers' surplus. Now, let's see how could we use a supply curve to calculate producer surplus. To do this, we will first find out how supply curve is related to producer's cost of production. The lesson here is basically supply curve gives you the seller's costs of production. So the process here is basically the same as the demand curve case. So let's say we are looking at different prices. If price is high, that is above 900, then all four sellers will be happy to offer their services. And price is 800 to 900. In this case, then we would have three sellers, right? So basically, in this case, we would have Frida, Georgia, and Grandma to offer their services. So we could do the same experiment, right? We could look at some other prices and we will find out, or we could draw a supply curve like this. Now, what is the lesson you can get from this supply curve? Well, the lesson you can get is, first, let's start talking about marginal seller, right? So let's look at the price of 900. So who is the marginal seller? Well, Mary is the marginal seller. How do you define a marginal seller? Marginal seller is the seller who would leave the market if price decreases by a little bit. Right? So you can see here that if Mary's willingness to pay is 900, so she would be indifferent from offering the pen job or not offering the pen job. So if the price decreases from $900 to a little bit, such as $899, in this case, Mary will not offer her service. Right? So she would leave the market. In this case, you can see that Mary is the marginal seller. And next, what you can see here is the supply curve essentially gives you a marginal seller's willingness to pay, right? For example, this section gives us Mary's willingness to pay. This section gives us Frida's, let me restart because we're talking about supply curve here, right? So basically, supply curve gives you seller's cost of production. So I should not use willingness to pay because this is a supply curve. Now you can see that at price of 800, right? This 800 gives you Frida's cost of production. And 600, well, this is Georgia's cost of production. And 500, this is Grandma's cost of production. So basically you can see that, to put it simply, supply curve tells you seller's cost of production. And now you can see that calculating producer surplus becomes simple. Once you understand supply curve gives you cost of production, right? For example, if we want to calculate Grandma's producer's surplus, we would only look at the area between the price and the supply curve. So in this case, you could see that the area equals 100 times 1, right? So it's 100. Now, let's say if the price is actually $800, we could see that we have two rectangles here. The first rectangle has an area of 300 times 1. The second has a 200 times 1. So the total would be 500. That is, the total surplus at price of $800 is 500. Okay, that's great. So now let's examine a question which is similar to the demand curve case. In the demand curve case, we talked about how lower price will affect consumer surplus. So a related question in the case of producer surplus, we could basically ask how a higher price will increase producer surplus. The first basic result is you would know that if price is higher, producer surplus should be higher, right? Because as a seller, you should be happier. You should be feeling better if you can sell your products or offer your services at a higher price. But how exactly, right? How exactly producer surplus would increase due to a price increase? So here, let's say we start from the case on the left-hand side. So basically, we have the price P1 here. And the producer surplus is given by ABC. And next, the price increases from P1 to P2. So in this case, you can see that the producer surplus is given by ADF. However, you can see that ADF can be basically decomposed into three parts. The original ABC, and this rectangle, which is DBCE, and this new triangle, which is ECF. So clearly, DBCE and ECF are the additional producer surplus because of a higher price, right? And we have also different explanations for the rectangle DBCE and for the triangle ECF. For the rectangle DBCE, it's the additional producer surplus to initial producers because of higher price. For the triangle ECF, it's the producer surplus to new producers. So the argument should be familiar to you guys. If you look at this left-hand side, we have quantity Q1. And still, we're looking at this quantity Q1. Here we could see that these same sellers, they are still selling in the market. However, they're selling at a higher price. So this causes additional producer surplus, right? And to be more specific, this is the additional producer surplus to initial producers, right? Those same sellers at price P1. And now for ECF, it's because now you're having a higher price, right? So for these sellers, they will basically enter the market because now they can sell at a profit. So this part is producer surplus because new producers enter the market. Now we could formally talk about market efficiency. So what's the definition of market efficiency? To understand this, market efficiency is essentially the sum of consumer surplus and producers surplus, right? So this is the very basic kind of definition. That is, we care about the two sides of the market, right? So we care about consumers and we care about sellers. So we want to look at the combined surplus, which is defined as total surplus, right? So total surplus equals consumer surplus and producer surplus's sum. And total surplus is a measure of market efficiency. And now you can see that Consumer surplus and the producer surplus is also equivalent to value to buyers minus the cost to sellers. How do you get this result? You have a simple proof here, but I can show you. This is actually very easy to understand. So we know that total surplus equals consumer surplus plus producer's surplus. And we also know that the consumer surplus is defined as willingness to pay minus price. And producer surplus is defined by price minus cost. So you can see that minus P and this plus P, they just offset with each other. So they will be canceled out. In this case, it's just willingness to pay minus cost, right? Okay, you can see that you have basically two ways to calculate total surplus. And obviously, you should get the same result from using these two methods. Graphically, these two methods will give you two kinds of different ways to find out total surplus. Okay, let me see if I have a example here. Okay, I'll just draw this example. So let's think, how could you find out a total surplus, right? So let's just look at this very simple case of oops, the app just crashed. So let me go back to the, so this is the slide we were just talking about. Now let's see, how could you find out total surplus? Let's start with the very simple case, right? So basically you have a demand curve and a supply curve, and you have a market equilibrium. In this case, if I ask you, hey, how do you calculate the total surplus? Well, obviously first you have to find out, you have to pin down what is the price, right? So what is the price? Well, this is the price, this is the quantity, right? Very simple. We have talked about this. And in this case, you can see that what is the consumer surplus? Well, this is consumer surplus, right? What is producer surplus? Well, this triangle gives you producer surplus. Now, according to the first method to calculate total surplus, you could see that if you want to calculate the total surplus, you have to first find out this consumer surplus, and you need to find out this producer surplus, right? And then you sum up these two numbers together. This gives you total surplus. Now, what about the second method? A value to buyers, that is willingness to pay minus cost. So for this second, let me redraw this. So for the second, if you're looking at this second definition, then consumer surplus is just defined by this large triangle, right? Why? Well, because it is calculated by the difference between willingness to pay, that is this line, and the cost to sellers, that is this line, right? So you can see that the area between the demand curve and the supply curve gives you the total surplus, right? Okay, let me summarize. I think I have talked a lot about market efficiency. First, we would want to measure market efficiency by using total surplus. Second, there are two ways to calculate total surplus. The first is you could first calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus, and then you sum up these two numbers. This would give you total surplus. Or you could directly find out the area between demand curve and supply curve. This will also give you total surplus. Okay, great. Now, because total surplus is a measure of market efficiency, so we could say that if a allocation maximizes total surplus, then we would say that it maximizes market efficiency. That is, you're looking at total surplus as a measure of market efficiency. If you find out a certain price quantity pair which gives you the largest possible total surplus, then you could say that the market is efficient. Or following the textbook, you could say that the allocation exhibits efficiency. So this is it's like the most simple case of calculating consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. So we have just finished this. We have just done this, right? So we looked at this competitive market and we learned about two methods to calculate total surplus. Now, the question is, if you look at this picture, right, you could answer the following two questions. Does it maximize total surplus, right? And is the equilibrium allocation efficient? Well, you can see that the first question is essentially equivalent to the second question, because if the market equilibrium E is maximizing total surplus, then the allocation at market equilibrium E has to be efficient, right? So now the question is whether the market equilibrium E allocates resources efficiently, right? Whether it is maximizing total surplus, right? So let's see this here. Where is this graph I am looking at? Okay, to answer this question, let's do some thought experiment, right? Let's say we're looking at alternative allocations. For example, I wanted to move the quantity to this larger quantity, right? So let's call this Q large, right? Now, under this quantity, can we get higher market efficiency? That is, can total surplus increase if I move from the equilibrium quantity to this alternative larger quantity? Well, the answer is no. Why? Why do we have this? Well, the reason is because if you look at the demand curve and supply curve, what you can see here is if quantity larger than equilibrium quantity, we can see that cost is larger than willingness to pay, right? How do you see this? Well, because demand curve is a measure of willingness to pay, and supply curve is a measure of cost. And you can see that if quantity is larger than equilibrium quantity, then supply curve is above demand curve. This implies cost is larger than willingness to pay, right? Okay, let me write this down because this is actually pretty important. So if quantity is larger than equilibrium quantity, we could observe supply curve is above demand curve. So this implies cost is larger than willingness to pay. And we just learned, right? We just learned total surplus can be calculated by value to buyers, that is willingness to pay minus cost. Here, if cost is larger than willingness to pay, this implies that for this little triangle, right? Consumer surplus is, for this little triangle, total surplus is actually negative. Right? So this implies market will become less efficient if we increase the quantity from the equilibrium quantity to a larger quantity. Now we could make the same argument. So let's say we're thinking about the opposite case. So the opposite case is about you would move from the equilibrium quantity to this smaller quantity. So let's call this as Q small. So here, if quantity becomes smaller than equilibrium quantity, let's see what will happen. In this case, let's focus on this little triangle, right? As you can see that if you move from equilibrium quantity to this smaller quantity, then this little triangle will be missing from the calculation of total surplus, right? But we can see that for this little triangle, we have demand curve above supply curve, which implies willingness to pay is larger than cost. This implies that the surplus for this little triangle is actually positive. And by decreasing quantity from equilibrium quantity to this smaller quantity, we're actually missing this positive amount of surplus. Again, this implies market becomes less efficient if we move to a lower quantity compared with equilibrium quantity, right? And basically we have shown that no matter what you do, once you deviate from equilibrium quantity, then market will become less efficient. This basically implies that market is the most efficient if we're at this equilibrium quantity, right? So this basically implies the following result. Market equilibrium maximizes total surplus, and the equilibrium allocation of resources is efficient under market equilibrium, right? I hope this argument gives you the clear idea why competitive equilibrium is efficient. And because we're having this video lecture here, so you could actually rewind for like several minutes to see how the argument goes. And do make sure that you understand why equilibrium maximizes total surplus. Okay, let's summarize. So we have two insights about market outcomes. First, free markets allocate the supply of goods to the buyers who value them most. And second, free market allocate the demand of goods to the sellers who can produce them at the lowest cost. Now, how do you get these two insights here? Okay, let me continue to use this picture to make the arguments. So you can see that the allocation here is efficient according to the so-called two insights, is because the market is efficiently allocating products to consumers who value them most and producers who can produce them at the lowest possible cost. And you can actually see this just from this very simple picture. You can see that if you compare the two sections of the demand curve, right? Okay, let me make this color a little bit more darker. Let's say you're comparing this section of demand curve versus this section of demand curve, right? You can see that every consumer on this section has higher willingness to pay. Higher willingness to pay than consumers on this curve, right? What does this mean? Well, it says market equilibrium allocates products to consumers with higher willingness to pay, right? Because in the end, consumers on this green section get the products, and consumers on this pink red section couldn't get their products, right? So this is an efficient allocation. The same argument can be made with producers. So let's look at two different sections of producers, right? And you can see that these producers on the green section, they have lower cost compared with producers on this blue section, right? And you can see that in the end, producers on the producers on the green section would sell in the market, and producers on the blue section couldn't sell in the market. So again, you can see that market is efficient because it lets the producers with lowest possible costs to produce and to sell in the market, right? Okay. Let's see. Oh, we have the third kind of argument. Can we increase total economic well-being by increasing or decreasing the quantity of the product? Well, we have made the argument, right? So the answer is clearly no, because free market, because the market equilibrium, it produces the quantity of products which maximizes total surplus, right? Okay, great. That's for the lecture. So let's look at some true-false problem. Oops, where I can see the true-false problem. That's weird. Okay, it's, okay, let's see chapter 7, true-false problem. Okay, we basically have 10 true-false problems here. So first, Joe has a 1966 Mustang, and he sold the car to Susie. And Susie is pleased because she paid $8,000 for the car, but would have been willing to pay $11,000 for the car. So Susie's consumer surplus is $2,000. So remember what's the or how to calculate consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is defined as the difference between willingness to pay and the price paid by the buyer. Here you can see that the buyer's willingness to pay is $11,000, and she actually paid $8,000. So her consumer surplus is $3,000, right? So this first statement is not correct because the number is just wrong. For any given quantity, the price on a demand curve represents the marginal buyer's willingness to pay. This is right. This is correct, right? So this is correct. The third, the area above the demand curve and below the price measures the consumer surplus in the market. So clearly you could actually draw this thing out. So we said if you have a demand curve, this is your demand curve, and you have a price, we said the consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price. And look at the statement here. It says above the demand curve and below the price. So you can see that the statement is not correct. You should exchange above and below. That is, below the demand curve and above the price. So let me write it here. It should be below and above. Fourth problem. A buyer is willing to buy a product at a price higher than or equal to his willingness to pay, but would refuse to buy a product at a price less than his willingness to pay. I mean, this is obviously false, right? Because essentially willingness to pay is the buyer's highest possible price this buyer could offer. So this is wrong. And I mean, if you could find a person in the world like this, then I guess you could sell him anything and earn a lot of money, because this guy would only purchase maybe the most expensive product, right? Okay, fifth, Connie can clean windows in a large office buildings at a cost of $1 per window. The market price for window cleaning is $3 per window. So if Connie cleans 100 windows, her producer's surplus would be 100. Here, basically, you can see that the cost is 1 and the price is 3. So for one window, the producer's surplus would be 2. And for 100 windows, producer surplus would be 200. So again, the number is not correct. The area below the price and above the supply curve measures the producer's surplus. Again, to get some clarity, you could draw this picture here. So quantity, price, supply curve, and price. And then we know that this gives you the producer surplus. So it's the area below the price and above the supply curve. And you can see that the statement here is correct. Total surplus in the market is consumer surplus minus producer surplus. This is about understanding the basic definition, right? And we know that total surplus is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So you should not use minus, you should use plus. Efficiency refers to whether a market outcome is fair, while equity refers to whether the market, while equity refers to whether the maximum amount of output was produced from a given number of inputs. I have not talked about equity, and I believe this is a definition from your from chapter 1. And in the future, when we talk about taxes, we will actually talk about equity. But anyway, let's just first, maybe this is a good chance to introduce what is a equity, right? So let's see whether this is correct. Efficiency refers to whether a market outcome is fair. So you can see that the definition here is not right? Because this is actually the definition of efficiency, right? So basically the correct statement is efficiency refers to whether the maximum amount of output was produced from a given number of inputs. And equity refers to whether a market outcome is fair. Basically, efficiency is like positive statement, and equity is like normative statement. If you care about fairness, if you want to make a judgment whether it's fair or not, then it's about equity. Right? So this statement here is not right. Ninth, total surplus in the market can be measured as the area below the supply curve and the area above the demand curve. This one is related to the second way of calculating total surplus, right? So if given a supply curve and demand curve, we know that, let me draw a better curve. Demand curve and supply curve. We know that the total surplus can be measured as the area like this. To be more precise, it's the area below the demand curve and above the supply curve. So you can see that the statement here is not correct. The correct statement should be below the demand curve and above the supply curve. Right. Okay. Next, 10th. Free market allocate. First, the supply of goods to the buyer, who value them most highly. The demand for goods to the sellers, who can produce them at least cost. This one is correct, right? We talk about this, and you can see that goods to buyers who value them most, and goods to sellers who can produce them at the least cost. Right? So this is the correct statement. Okay, I have several minutes left. So let me start chapter 8. So I would just start maybe first several pages in this lecture note. Chapter 8 is about thinking about taxes, right? You can see that we actually talked about tax before. Basically, we talk about tax burden, right? And we find out the tax incidence. That is, the tax burden will be shared between buyers and sellers, no matter who actually pays the tax. And further, we also found out how this tax burden is shared depends on the elasticities of demand curve and supply curve. And in that case, we basically have another result. That is, once you charge tax, then the tax will actually put a wedge between the demand and the supply. And more importantly, the market equilibrium quantity will be smaller, right? So in this class, we want to examine taxation from the perspective of market efficiency, because we just learned about how to define and how to measure market efficiency, right? So this is a good chance to put what we have learned into this application. Okay, great. So if you think about the taxation case we just talked about in the previous, no, not in the previous, in the, I think it's in chapter 6. Now, in that chapter, right, we learned if there is a tax, then the tax will put a wedge. So this is the wedge we're talking about between the buyers and sellers. And importantly, you can see that quantity with tax will be smaller. If you recall, we just learned about in chapter 7, you would see that market efficiency should be smaller, right? Because we learned the market equilibrium, this dot, gives you the largest possible market equilibrium. The red dot, the market equilibrium here, gives you the largest possible total surplus. So market is efficient at the quantity, the equilibrium quantity without tax. Now, because of tax, we're having a smaller quantity. So we should expect there should be some efficiency loss, right? And you could also look at the efficiency implications from the perspective of buyers, sellers, and the government. You can see that because of the tax, buyers, they're paying a higher price, right? This is the price buyers pay, and it is higher compared with the original price, right? Compared with the price of tax. So you should expect consumer surplus decreases because of consumers are paying higher price. Now, if you look at price sellers receive, it is smaller compared with price without tax. So producer surplus should also decrease, right? However, we have to think about the role of government. Government is imposing taxes. This implies that the government will get some tax revenue, right? So that's called as TR, which is short for tax revenue, right? And tax revenue actually increases because previously, when there was no tax, then obviously tax revenue was just zero. And now we have a positive amount of tax. So obviously, tax revenue increases, right? So here, our purpose is we would want to understand how the total welfare changes. Because you can see that if you just look at these three components, right, you can see that you really don't know whether the increase in tax revenue could offset the decrease in consumer surplus or producers, or let me rephrase this. So just look at these three components. You don't actually know that whether the increase in tax revenue can offset the decrease in consumer surplus or producer surplus or not, right? So you're not sure about this. And that's basically what we're going to talk about in the next class.